Ridley Scott's Alien is one of the most terrifying films ever. But this isn't the scariest thing about it. No, the hidden horror lurking in the shadows of the film isn't the xenomorph. It's something far more sinister. And I'll reveal it in this video, with a little help from this man. Karl Marx. Yes, the guy who wrote the book on capitalism. What does he have to do with it? Well, that'll become clear as we plunge deeper into the film in 4 stages. Those stages are 1. The untold origins of Alien. 2. The dark reality of life aboard the USS Nostromo. 3. The secret hidden within the alien itself. And 4. The shocking truth about the film, which you need to stick around for. Let's plug in.
So all these historians that have piled on you saying,
In his old age, and with dozens of mid-tier films under his belt, it's easy to conclude that Ridley Scott is a bit of a hack.
Are you kidding me? Sorry, beep.
But back in the day, he was much more serious about his craft. If you get the chance to read The Making of Alien, you'll see that he spent loads of time on even the tiniest details of the film. That included creating a whole new backstory for it, which I'm going to quote here because it is important to our discussion of capitalism. The world has been converted into the property of 2 or 3 large conglomerates, whose sources of energy are provided by the exploitation of deposits in space. The supercargo spaceships that link Earth and the planets would transport enormous loads of minerals, gas, oil and the like. To dissuade the crews from rebelling and to protect their own interests, these companies might place spies aboard, or at least would make the crews believe in the presence of such spies. What this backstory did was place the events of the film in a much wider context. It became about so much more than just another alien running loose on a spaceship. That's probably why it's been such an influential film over the years. And since that's the case, it's worth considering how Ridley Scott came up with that backstory, so we can uncover the untold origins of Alien.
And I think that's what makes it stronger, is the reality, not the fantasy. Yeah?
To start with, let's go back to that quote and pull it apart a bit. There are 3 key points in it. One is the idea of conglomerates ruling the world, indeed the galaxy. 2 is the exploitation of minerals in space. 3 is the rebellion of the workers. I'll break it down further. First, there's this point about worker rebellion. That's significant because in 1979, there was a huge industrial dispute going on in the UK. Over 1.5 million workers went on strike against the government's austerity policies. Those workers took effective control of several cities, shut down parts of the country, and forced the government onto the back foot. In this political climate, the idea of rebellion, or class struggle, was impossible to ignore. It even filtered into Alien, which is no surprise given it was produced at the same time and place as the strikes. Likewise with point 2, about the exploitation of minerals. That became a massive real-world issue from the mid-1970s onwards, after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Reacting to Western interference in the war, the oil-producing countries of the Middle East embargoed oil shipments to the United States and several European countries. The embargo was felt most by working people, who paid vastly inflated prices for energy, and it led to an overall decline in the capitalist economies of North America and Europe.
We are limiting the use of electricity by almost all factories, shops and offices to 3 days a week.
Natural resources, energy and minerals thus became major issues during the 1970s. And our Ridley certainly took notice. Not only did he build that into the backstory of Alien, he also changed the setting of the film from a military vessel to a kind of futuristic oil tanker. And finally, let's look at the conglomerates. Capitalism may have been in crisis, but the 1970s also saw a huge increase in corporate power and the beginning of a shift towards their dominance over national governments.
We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
3 giant corporations undertook record-breaking mergers during the decade. The acquisitions made by General Electric, Shell and Exxon expanded their already vast reach. But it wasn't just that corporations were getting bigger. They also bankrolled politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who could be relied upon to crack down on the working class and grease the wheels for business. By the end of the 1970s, the capitalist class was ready to open a deadly new front in the class war, something that R. Ridley saw happening and incorporated into the script for Alien. What that means is that the origins of the film aren't wholly science fictional. They're grounded in the crisis of capitalism that was taking place during the 1970s. As a film about the present, that means that the dilemmas the characters on the Nostromo face aren't wholly fantastical. They're grounded in a surprising and dark sense of reality, as we'll see in the next part.
What do we do now?
They've caned to Ash. You get back to work.
Oh, what?
What's the if you got any business on here?
The biggest problem facing the characters in Alien is that they don't get paid enough. Well, that's what they think their biggest problem is. Of course, there's far worse waiting for them later in the film.
I feel dead. Anybody ever tell you look dead, man?
But I was struck when reading the making of Alien that the filmmakers considered the crew of the Nostromo to be working class. More specifically, they identified the characters Parker and Brett, the ship's engineers, as the working class Joes, who were in conflict with the rest of the crew. In this scene from the start of the film, they raise the thorny topic of the bonus situation.
Right. Brett and I, we think we deserve full shares, right, Henry?
It's a key moment that really drives home how Alien is about more than just the alien. It's about the dark reality of life on the Nostromo, and a pointed critique of capitalism. To understand that a bit better, let's stick with this moment. While Parker and Brett do have a legitimate complaint, in my opinion, the way they go about raising it is all wrong. As someone who's involved in a trade union, I know that you don't build solidarity by annoying your fellow workers. You have to find rallying points across diverse sectors of the workforce. Because there are plenty of things that divide the working class, like artificially different salary scales, for example. But there is a common bond, which is that we're all being exploited by the bourgeoisie. The problem here is that while Parker and Brett know they're being exploited, they don't have the class consciousness to analyse it or deal with it effectively. What they display, in fact, is a false consciousness. Their mindset reflects not their own economic interests, but those of their capitalist employers. As Marx wrote about this subject, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The ruling class controls institutions like government, the legal system, and the media, and because of that, they can distract the workers from building bonds with each other. This sums up the characters of Parker and Brett.
What the hell's she coming down here for? You better stay the fuck out of the way.
Parker and Brett bought into the capitalist values of the society that they live in, which prioritises the short-term gratification of needs over long-term human flourishing. We see that when Parker admits he just wants the money so he can have a good time.
I don't want to hear it.
We don't know that's intelligent.
I want to go home and party.
Parker, will you just listen to the man?
And we later see that the pair of them are lazy Jobsworths, not working class radicals. As much as this is all played for laughs, I do find it to be quite a dark subplot, because it shows us how capitalism isn't just an economic phenomenon, it also roots itself in our minds and bodies, rather like the alien itself, and convinces us to do things that are totally outside our own interests. It reminds me of the rest of that Marx quote about capitalists controlling the mental means of production. If that's the case, then is it possible to break free of that brainwashing? Or are we trapped in a situation a bit like the one Brett suggests when he says,
Our time is their time, and that's the way they see it.
at least in the first hour of Alien, it seems that we are trapped. That's obvious from the jump. When the camera tracks through the Nostromo as it comes to life, we see all these electronic and mechanical systems activating. And at the end of the sequence, the cryogenic sleep chambers are automatically released, and the crew are forced to wake up. They don't have a choice in the matter. Like the other instruments, the company activates them because it needs them to do something. Capitalism has dehumanised them to the point where they have no autonomy over their lives. They've become machines, literally a machine in the case of Ash. Once again, Marx put this best when he wrote that Labour produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity, and does so in the proportion in which it produces commodities generally. As such, the worker can be dispensed with whenever it's no longer profitable to keep them. And this is what happens towards the end of the film, when Ripley discovers the crew are considered expendable by the company.
There is an explanation for this, you know.
It's a chilling moment, one that really drives home the dark reality of life aboard the Nostromo. The crew are treated like machines, incapable of independent thought, and left to die at the hands of a highly lethal alien life form. Speaking of which, it's now time for us to move on from the crew to the xenomorph itself. Quick question. Do you think this is scary? Not literally this. The character of the xenomorph. Do you think it's scary? Because, let me tell you, I see shit like this literally every day. And in fact, so do you. You see, there's a secret hidden within the xenomorph. A secret that when we uncover it, will make it seem like a very trivial thing indeed. How do we go about uncovering that secret? Well, let's fast forward towards the end of the film and focus on a line of dialogue that Ripley has, which is really quite significant. Listen to what she says.
All I can think of is they must have wanted the alien for the weapons division. He's been protecting it right along.
Now what that line does is it explicitly positions the alien as a thing that has a value for someone, that someone being the company. For them it's more than just a giant scary killer monster. It's... well, what's another word for a useful thing? To get you thinking about that, let's rewind to the start of the film, when the crew discovers the egg. It's extremely dangerous, but it isn't yet the perfect killing machine that it becomes later on. It only takes that form when it consumes the unfortunate Kane's nerves, muscles and brain. But importantly, it isn't just Kane who's involved in the creation of the alien. No, if we were to have like an organisational chart of all the people who were actually involved, Kane would be at the top. But then you'd have the crew of the Nostromo who piloted the flight to get to the alien. You'd have the team of scientists who uncovered the alien over here. Then you'd have the engineers who built Ash, a very important component of this plot. You'd have them over there. Without any of those people, the alien would never have evolved into its final form. So the creation of this thing depends on the off-screen labour of dozens of other characters. And as a thing that's absorbed useful labour, it has what we would call exchange value. Now, exchange value is defined by a certain someone as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort. And when Marx wrote that about exchange value, he was trying to find the overall value of various different things like watches, linen, silk, gold, iron, wheat, all very different things, united by the fact that they are all commodities. Commodities. These things that surround us in everyday life that we spend our life buying. As Marx defined it, a commodity has an exchange value, which is determined by the amount of socially necessary human labour power involved in the creation of it. It lets us compare the values of very different items, since all commodities are products of labour power, and they also all have a use value, which is their usefulness. Every commodity on your shelves, bedroom, desk, all of these have the same two elements, and so does the alien. The alien then is a commodity, with both a use value to the company and an exchange value, since labour power has created value by transforming the egg into a fully grown xenomorph. Both of those things tell us that the alien is a commodity, and as a commodity, it has value. But we actually already knew that, because Ridley Scott shows us at the start of the film how valuable it is to the company. He included this on-screen text, which tells us first of all that the Nostromo is a commercial towing vessel, carrying 20 million tonnes of mineral ore. That shipment is diverted so that the crew can pick up the alien, indicating that the alien is a higher priority than even valuable minerals. And since that mineral ore was excavated out of the ground by human labour power, and remember, labour power is the key to determining value, we can say that one alien has equivalent value to 20 million tonnes of mineral ore. The creature is a spicy meatball. Now, you might object to that theory on the grounds that the alien is a living creature. It's not a machine, it's not been made in a factory. But as Marx pointed out in Capital, just about anything could be a commodity, including human labour power. And other natural things can be commodities too. As he wrote in Volume 1 of Capital, labour is, in the first place, a process in which both man and nature participate, and in which man, of his own accord, starts, regulates and controls the material reactions between himself and nature. What he's saying is that human labour power can transform raw materials, like plants or animals, to give them use and exchange values. As he went on to write, animals and plants, which we are accustomed to consider as products of nature, are in their present form not only products of, say, last year's labour, but the result of a gradual transformation, continued through many generations under man's superintendence, and by means of his labour. This is exactly what happens in a compressed amount of time to the alien. With Kane's genetic imprint, it swiftly transforms into the perfect weapon that the company seeks. And crucially, the implication in the film is that this is a deliberate process, one that Ash is manipulating on behalf of the company. That's suggested very subtly in this scene where he reveals the tracker device. Watch the interplay between him and Ripley here. She thinks that he knows more about the creature than he's letting on, and she tries to catch him out, because if he can track the creature, that implies he already knows something about its biology.
What's it key on?
Micro changes in air density.
But instead he comes up with some techno-babbly explanation for it, dodging her trap.
Micro changes in air density, my ass.
The point is, Ash knows how the creature works already, and how to accelerate its evolution. Presumably, his superiors in the company have implanted that knowledge into his memory banks. That means that Ash is a bit like the supervisor overseeing a production process, and if that's the case, then the Nostromo would be a factory, the crew of the Nostromo the unwilling, sometimes unwitting workers, and the alien itself is the commodity they're producing. That's the secret hidden within the creature. But there's a bit more to it than that, because what that secret does is sharpen the anti-capitalist critique of the film. We've already seen that life on board the Nostromo is miserable, but it's actually far worse than we originally thought, because a commodity like the alien is worth far more than the people who produced it. And this goes back to a point that Marx made, where in capitalism, he, the worker, is governed by the products of his own hand. Workers depend on the wages that they get by producing commodities that are then alienated from them by their capitalist master. What happens in Alien is a literal account of this process, but the alien is also a metaphor for the mastery of the product over the producer, as Friedrich Engels put it. And that's very much still a fact of life in our own time, when we think about sweatshop workers, or miners, or economic migrants from the global south, all of whom are forced to work in unsafe conditions for a pittance of pay, even as the commodities they produce create huge profits for their bosses. However, there is an upside here, as working in these conditions also brings workers closer together, and can lead to a shift from that false consciousness we saw earlier to class consciousness, where workers come together to challenge their exploitation. Capitalism, as Marx wrote, produces its own gravediggers. And it looks like that's what's happening in this scene from later in Alien, when Parker is shaken out of false consciousness by Ash's revelations about the company, and gives us a line of dialogue for the ages.
And a damn company. What about our lives, you son of a bitch? I repeat.
Based on all that we've just discussed, you would have reasonable grounds to think that Alien is a strongly anti-capitalist film. And that would certainly be true if it ended there. But it actually goes on for another half an hour, and what happens next? Well, what happens next might surprise you. The last 30 minutes of Alien is brilliantly directed and also complete rubbish. Sacrilege, you say? Well, consider this. Ridley Scott set up a couple of major themes in the first two acts of the film. You have the crew struggling with the dark reality of life aboard the Nostromo, and you also have the secret hidden within the Xenomorph. Those anti-capitalist themes come together towards the end of the film. Confronted by their own exploitation, the crew resist, which would surely mean taking down the company, since it's the company that has forced them into this horrifying situation. But as our Ridley moves into the last act of the film, that idea gets forgotten about. The film doesn't end with the destruction of the company, as you might think it would if it was an anti-capitalist film. No, it ends with the destruction of the alien itself. And I suppose that does make sense on the level of the film being called Alien. But not so much on a thematic level, because the alien is, after all, only a symptom of the company's rampant drive for profit. So why did Ridley Scott take a right turn in spite of everything that had happened earlier in the film? Well, it's here that I'm going to lay out a shocking truth about the film. And it wasn't difficult to come to that realisation, not if you remember that Alien was funded by 20th Century Fox. Now, Fox was one of the biggest Hollywood movie studios of the 1970s. It was in the business of profit. And profit in the film industry meant creating a film that could tap into a pre-existing audience. And if you sell science fiction fans on a film about a deadly alien, your finale sure as hell better feature that alien being flushed into outer space. Not a revolution against some shadowy corporation. That relationship between the economic base and the societal superstructure, where creative decisions are determined by economic factors, ensures that most Hollywood films avoid any kind of radical stance whatsoever. So the film ends not with a revolution, but with Ripley returning to the same capitalist network that nearly killed her off. Even though that contradicts the rest of the film's plot. So the whims of a capitalist movie studio led to a bastardised creative vision. But in case you're wondering, that's not the only shocking truth about Alien. In fact, there's more to it than that, because the film doesn't just reject anti-capitalism, it ends up promoting a bourgeois reactionary perspective that ultimately serves capitalism. How does it do that? Well, it's here that I want us to consider an idea called the narrative of intrusion. The narrative of intrusion was identified by an American film critic called Judith Hess. She found this narrative in Hollywood science fiction films of the 1950s, which reflected paranoia about communism. But I think it also expresses some of the racial and sexual paranoias of the time. Hess wrote, "Confronted by the other, there's only one possible response. We must use every scientific means at our disposal to destroy the invader." Now, when we're looking at Alien, it's obvious which character would be the other that Hess describes. And throughout the film, we've seen the characters try to use science to destroy the Xenomorph, although the chief scientist in Alien is Ash, who is actually using science to protect the creature. But if Ridley Scott diverges from some aspects of the narrative of intrusion, he returns to them with a vengeance by the end of the film. Because in the final act, and this is so important, the alien becomes a plot device to justify the miserable existence that capitalism fosters. As Hess writes, the other does not share our values, like individualism, deference, duty, all those good things that capitalists bang on about. These are the values that Ripley ultimately comes to stand for at the end of the film. On the other hand, the alien is recontextualised. If it appeared to be a commodity before, it now represents something quite different, a racial and indeed sexual outsider. Consider the design of the alien's final form. The inspiration for this, acknowledged by Ridley Scott, were photos of Sudanese tribesmen, photos that were highly exoticised, portraying the tribesmen in a stereotypical way. And who took those photos? Oh, just a little known German artist by the name of Leni Riefenstahl, who was of course most notorious for being Adolf Hitler's favourite film director. Which means that the alien is, indirectly, the product of a racist woman's racist photography. Now, that idea of the alien as a bearer of racial stereotypes about African people is complicated by the fact that the creature was performed by Nigerian artist Balaji Badejo. But Badejo's time on set was marked by difficult working conditions. He was paid not a lot of money to do quite a lot of hard physical work in that monstrosity of a rubber suit. and he was kept separate from the rest of the cast as well, and they came to view him as this kind of exotic object. In that way, the racial stereotypes that were in the script of the film ultimately then influenced the production of it. We should also note here that out of nowhere, despite showing no interest whatsoever in sexual relations with any of the characters, the alien starts to perv on the half-naked Ripley. That's a spicy little hint of miscognation, the deeply racist idea that sexual relations with the other would lead to the degeneration of white European civilization. It's an old idea used to drive a wedge between workers of different races by the capitalist class. The problem with that is that if you have other film critics saying that this is an anti-capitalist film, that might lead to belief that the narrative of intrusion is consistent with a anti-capitalist Marxist perspective, which it's not. Emphatically, it's not. What's Marx's famous last line in the Communist Manifesto? Workers of the world unite. He didn't want a bunch of gammons in England to unite.
We're the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Or a bunch of MAGA communists in America to unite and sod everyone else. No, he wanted workers from all over the world, from all different races, to come together to overthrow capitalism. What the narrative of intrusion actually does is advocate for the opposite, the protection of our society from the sinister other. And that's deliberate on the part of Hollywood, who have a vested interest in stifling anti-capitalist dissent. Part of the blame should go to Ridley Scott, though, for abandoning the anti-capitalist themes of the film halfway through it. Although, what do you expect? Ridley Scott has never struck me as in any way a political filmmaker, and in Alien, all these political themes were injected into it just to give it a bit of gravitas, otherwise it would have been a daft B-movie. That's why he pulled inspiration from the economic situation of the late 1970s. But while the film does show us the dark reality of life on the Nostromo, that counts for nothing if the message of the film sets back our resistance against capitalism.
Procedure is to do what the hell they tell you to do.
And that's the most shocking truth about Alien. That a film with, on the surface, very anti-capitalist themes actually ends up serving the interests of the capitalist class. But what does that tell us about the hidden horror of the film? The horror that lurks in the shadows of every frame, like the xenomorph itself. To reveal that, let's finally go back to Marx. In one of his early manuscripts, he wrote that an inhuman power rules over everything. And when he wrote that, he meant that under capitalism, the worker doesn't live and work for themselves, but for the good of the capitalist. The worker becomes just another instrument in the production process. The worker's labour power is controlled as a commodity by the capitalist. That same theme applies to Alien, the inhuman power of capitalism ruling over the crew of the Nostromo. And it even applies to the filmmakers of Alien, the inhuman power of capitalism determining key creative decisions and instilling that power in the minds of its viewer. That's the true horror of capitalism, that mental hold it has over people. But revealing it isn't enough. What you need is a Marxist cinema to inspire viewers to challenge that inhuman power and overcome it. That being the case, there's no sense in forcing an anti-capitalist reading onto a film like Alien that resists it. That just leads to confusion and ultimately false consciousness, which we don't want. But that doesn't mean we should ignore all examples of genre cinema. There are in fact times when it can be quite useful in the fight against capitalism. And if you want to see what that looks like, click the link on screen right now.